Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, dear brothers, sisters and friends, and welcome to this evening's big discussion one-on-one. I'm your host Salman, and I'm pleased to invite our guest Asim Qureshi, the research director at Cage, into the studio today with us. You may remember a few weeks ago we had Sheikh Sajid Umar in his place. We were talking about some pertinent issues about da'wah. Has da'wah become industrialized? Has da'wah become edutainment? And those types of conversations. And we have the recordings on islam20c.com. But today's discussion is about something slightly different but also equally important in our eyes. Today's discussion is about the Muslim power. Can Muslims do their own politics? Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi Asim. A few weeks ago, actually last month, we had a joint event on the day after Trump came to the UK. A few Islam20c and Cage speakers were talking about different motifs surrounding oppression, tyranny, tyrants, and so forth. And one of the recurring themes of that evening was the need for Muslims to produce or develop their own voices and their own narratives, independent of other kind of narratives and discourses. In your opinion, what spurred that conversation?
Right. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Yeah, I think there's been various kind of moments over the years that have really made me think about this issue in particular. I mean, just even within the last year or so, just thinking about some of the conversations that I've been having with people. I remember I wrote a report not too long ago, and we did this kind of pre-launch of the report for the Muslim community. And
what was the report, if you don't mind me asking?
The report was about something called the Extreme Risk Guidance 22 Plus.
Right,
it's like a psychological tool that the government uses as part of its prevent program. So we were debunking the fraudulent science that goes into this thing. So we had done a whole report about this. It was very unique at the time. Nobody else had, across all the different disciplines, had even looked at this issue. And so we were coming out with it for the first time. So in this kind of community briefing that we were doing the night before the launch, we presented our findings to all of these brothers and sisters who turned up. And at the end of it, when we were doing the Q&A with the community to ask them, and really the crowd was made up of the leaders or the heads of kind of all the major Muslim organizations that operate, particularly in London, who have like an activist leaning or from certain masajid. So one person in particular, he said to me, "This is really amazing work. I can't believe that you guys have really put all of this effort and put this whole thing together, and it's going to make a really big difference." And then he said, "Don't you think you could have asked a non-Muslim to front this report for you instead?"
I remember that.
Yeah.
I remember that time, yeah.
Okay, and that was really, problematic for me, And I was actually very shocked to the extent I was actually left dumbfounded. That doesn't happen to me very often, that I don't have a response to somebody. But I didn't even know how to deal with that in the moment because I was just so astonished.
But do you see where that person was coming from, though? Because this is actually quite a widespread kind of sentiment or feeling throughout the Muslim community. That if you want something to go mainstream, if you want something to be big, then we need, non-Muslims. You need, to be blunt, white people, to give you that signal boost and.
I've heard that. I've heard that before, and I think that part of the problem with that is that this brother in particular is from an organization that really pushes Muslim empowerment. This idea that Muslims are here, we're part of the society, we should be making a contribution, and yet here he was giving me the exact opposite message.
Yeah.
Because for me, when you say that, the message that you're sending to our community is we don't belong, our voices aren't heard, and they shouldn't be heard, and that we have to play the game in order to get our message across, right? So I think we have to ask ourselves, have a very, very real discussion within ourselves about what does that mean long term? Because how long does this situation last? How long do we have to keep on playing that game? Because we've been playing that game for a very, very long time. And I don't think we've had the impact that playing that game brings about.
It's similar to the chapter you have in your book called on the topic of representation.
Right.
That maybe if we get Muslims into these mainstream parties or organizational movements, then that will be that would be good for the Muslim community. And isn't there some truth in that argument?
I think there is some truth in that argument. And I think that's part of the complexity of the chapter in the book, Virtue of Disobedience. I don't come to a specific conclusion on that point, but what I do say is that there is a difficulty that's associated with playing that politics in particular, because the idea is that you go up and you move through the ranks until you get to a certain position, and once you're in that position, then you are able to speak on behalf of the community. But the question is, what do you have to give up while going along the way, right? Because what we've seen with lots of the Muslim MPs here in the UK, or Muslim politicians, because they're not just MPs, we have other political figures who aren't elected necessarily, is that sometimes they're able to do good, but at the same time, they struggle to say what's right when there are certain political environments in place. So we'll often hear from them in private meetings that, well, now isn't an opportune time to talk about this, that, or the other. So, I'm not saying that their job is easy. Their job is very, very, very difficult. And we shouldn't necessarily just ignore that.
Because there is a tendency to maybe look at this in a very simple way, that was saying, you have to speak the truth and say what's right and do what's right, and, regardless of the consequences. But there do have to be some people involved in that business of actually, not pushing everyone into a kind of very maybe a crass pragmatism where nothing is sacred anymore. But there still has to be some flexibility in how you apply and how you choose to do certain things and say certain things, right? It's a kind of continuum always where there's always in any kind of movement. I have a Jewish friend who's a rabbi,
right?
And he was doing his PhD was in actually studying this Jewish man who actually worked with the Nazis, right, in order to save. What he was doing was in order to save hundreds of or thousands of Jews, but in doing so he had to enter the system, and it brought up these very same kinds of conundrums.
Yeah. So even in my book, I talk about the case of Adam Chernow, who was the head of the Warsaw ghetto camp, and he was responsible for managing the Warsaw ghetto, which the SS effectively put him in charge of, right? So now he's tasked with micromanaging this despicable ghetto where literally people are being abused every single day, and he gets to a stage where they start doing these mass train journeys towards the concentration camps, and he's told, you have one of two options. You either give us the lists of those people who should be deported to the concentration camps from the ghetto, or the 100 hostages that we've taken, which include your wife, we will execute them. Now, Chernow decides that he's in a situation that is impossible for him, so he takes cyanide tablets and kills himself. And he writes, I think it's something along the lines of, I won't be responsible for the deaths of the children of our nation, right? That's a very extreme example, though, of a situation that you find yourself in where you are responsible for the deaths of people on either side. It was either hundreds of thousands of people to the concentration camps or the 100 people that they had held hostage. Now, most of the time, we're not in that extreme a situation, and I don't think we should use extremes in order to derive entire kind of philosophies about the way that we should act, right?
Of course.
So I find it difficult to agree with you entirely about what you're saying.
The extremes are on a continuum,
right?
And you tend to see people, not maybe because of their Islamic opinions or whatever. It could just be their personality type as well. Some people are a bit more tend to be a bit more rigid and more idealistic. Some people tend to be less so and a bit more, kind of, I was saying Urdu chalak.
Okay, yeah.
Maybe a bit cunning.
Yeah, right.
That kind of stuff. So, or willing to kind of play the game, so to speak, right? Whatever business they're in, right? And you always see this kind of, and these are obviously extremes. On one end, people saying, okay, I'm going to chip away at, slowly chip away at the system from within. I'm trying to work within the system to change the system. And then the other extreme is people saying, no, you can't, the system itself is inherently corrupt and you have to overthrow the system, or the kind of revolutionary mindset. So it speaks to this kind of continuum and where you particularly sit along that, doesn't it?
Potentially. I mean, I think it's a difficult area. I'm actually working on the second edition of the book already, and in the second edition, I'm positing an idea about how we think about this particular moment. Like, how do you make these decisions? And the idea of my head right now is like, is there like a test that we could have that helps us understand whether or not the decision that we're making is the right decision? And so, like, perhaps we should be thinking about, like, who benefits from this position that you're taking on any given issue. So if you find yourself that you are personally benefiting in some way from taking a specific position, then that might be problematic. But also, I think the other part of any kind of test should be, off the back of who are you taking that position? So if you take a position that not only benefits you, but comes off the back of somebody else's oppression, then I think that's deeply problematic. And it's something that I think we don't think about enough when we make statements or we engage at the political level. So often you find, for example, people make statements about Palestine, the Palestinian struggle, right? Which will do disservice to the Palestinians and what they've been going through since the Nakba, okay? But they will say to you, well, we have to deal with the situation that we've got going on in the UK. We have to deal with Islamophobia that's going on in the UK. And so sometimes we have to make concessions in relation to other things that are part of our struggle, but aren't so immediately within our concern, so we can deal with the stuff that's going on here. Now, for me, that thinking is faulty, because you automatically set up a divide between your morals, your ethics, your faith, with what's going on elsewhere in the world. These are divides that have been set up along colonial lines, okay? And that is important for us to bear in mind, that actually what we're doing when we say stuff like that is we're replicating colonial boundary making, something that hasn't existed. If Islam's 1,450 years old, right? Like that sentiment has only been really evident in the last 100 years. So you're really even taking into account something that's an anomaly within our history, within our tradition.
So you're actually not coming from a position of just kind of being idealistic or dogmatic. It appears that you're actually coming from a position of actually looking at consequences, looking pragmatically and saying, wait a minute, if we do, ignore Palestine for the sake of a kind of a political win or a benefit here, then there are actually bigger, broader negative consequences for that in the grand scheme of things.
I don't like the word pragmatism because it just automatically evokes this idea that you're having to give up something. I think for me the point that I'm always trying to make is that your principles have to come first. Now, are you able to take a position on a matter that keeps your principles intact, while trying to understand the landscape in front of you? That's the hard part. I'm not saying that I have a solution to every single question that people have or every single scenario. And that's why it's important that we have an understanding about how we make that decision. But it can't be based on somebody's like personal fear and personal anxiety, right? Because that isn't good enough. It's not good enough for our community that because you have a personal angst about an issue, that you then kind of amplify that because of the platform that you have. And that's what we have to be very careful about, that we don't allow our own kind of personal feelings to get in the way of these larger, more political statements that we're making.
So that's in terms of, for example, doing something or maybe forsaking a cause for the sake of another cause, or getting a bit of mileage on another cause. For example, in that example you gave that started this thing off, of maybe giving that report to maybe a non-Muslim organization or institution, you would be sacrificing some of the internal Muslim empowerment in the long run. Right. So that's an understandable argument, right? And I think in looking at this as not just a black and white thing, but something where people are going to have different viewpoints, different not just ideals. We have the same ideals, but people have different ways of concretizing them, and juggling different values and ideals and masalih to kind of in a particular context. So that person might have thought this is more important than A is more important than B. You're thinking actually B is more important than A, and you can have that conversation, argument in that way. And I think that leads us on well to the actual what do we do now? So the status quo is, it seems although there's a great deal of cooperation and goodwill amongst Muslim organizations, and especially the more kind of politically active, activist type organizations. Although there is a great deal of cooperation and unity, alhamdulillah, I think there is no recourse in such a context but to try and get as many Muslims internally together around a table and have these discussions and have these arguments. And that leads us on to the title of today's conversation, which is, can Muslims do their own politics? Because invariably what we see is we often piggyback on other maybe groups or non-Muslim kind of movements. For example, cooperating with left-wing journalists, or to get a story out, or politicians to get some mileage on some kind of legislation or whatever, or policy, or even right-wing. So sometimes we might ally with right-wing organizations on things like abortion or same-sex marriage, for example. Where are the limits there? Because when that happens, and it's invariably going to happen, it has been happening, you have other voices in that conversation that are maybe more powerful than the internal Muslim conversations, that have their own interests, that some of which overlaps with the Muslims, a lot of which doesn't, right? How do you navigate that? What's your advice to Muslims at university, cutting their teeth in student activism, getting joining their unions, joining these kind of political organizations? What do you say to them?
I think it's a hard one, right? Because
apart from read my book.
No. I mean, it's not even like, actually, I don't think I even deal with this in any kind of significant way in the book, because I think it is quite a difficult territory, right? You want to alliance build. That's kind of your natural inclination, right? But it's difficult to alliance build when you have competing, rights and obligations, not only to your fellow human beings, but of course, as Muslims, we also have obligations towards Allah, right? So this is like something that often we forget about when we think about, what does it mean to cooperate or to ally, that actually Allah Himself has rights on us, and we have to respect those obligations that we have. And I think that, we've been given that cooperate on righteousness and God consciousness, right? So it's a two-part test that, when you see righteousness, yes, cooperate with other people, with other groups, okay, but being fearful or mindful of what God wants at the same time. So, strike that balance between the two. And, when we talk about ta'awun, kind of like cooperating with other people, like, you know, the group that I'm most famously affiliated with is Cage, right? So like, that's a group of people that I work with, that, you know, I have constant daily interactions with. Our thinking is quite similar on a number of issues. Yes, we debate and argue about a number of different points, you know, every day within the office. But largely, this is a group of people who I am in the same kind of political space as, right? So it's difficult for me to cooperate with this group because I'm already in that group.
Yeah,
When we're talking about
it's
cooperating, you actually have to kind of reach out to groups and people that aren't specifically within that circle of friendship or, you know, kind of camaraderie that you have. So, you know, I think that's an important thing that we sometimes forget, that, yeah, cooperate, but cooperating in and of itself, in the way that the word is constructed, kind of requires a reaching out, a drawing in. And so also, I think, you know, what we need to be careful of is that we don't become so insular that we forget that actually we need to bridge build, we need to join hands with other people and deal with, you know, kind of the many multifaceted issues that we face. You know, I go on about this more so than anything else, that the reason why, part of the reason why Islamophobia exists is because racism was never dealt with as an issue. Okay, it's
How is that?
Because Islamophobia is a very easy jump to think from racism. The entire platform for racism, let's take the UK for example, with Stop and Search, with the sus laws in the 80s, through the way that you know, black people are specifically discriminated against within the criminal justice system. You know, every single aspect of the way that the system was already constructed to discriminate against one group was
easy to repurpose.
It was easy to repurpose for the in the context of the war on terror. So, you know, that's my point is that, you know, actually, if Muslims had been more even ethical in our activism a long time ago, we wouldn't have just said, oh, we need to support the rights of black people. You know, well, of course, Muslims are black people too, but, you know, specifically in that context of just pure racism, right? Because one day we might, as Muslims, get affected. No, we should have said to ourselves, the ethical position is that black people are suffering, right? Or people of color are suffering. And until we deal with that racism that affects them more significantly than us, then, you know, we shouldn't stop being
So it's
active.
important to, you know, work together on common goals. I don't think anyone, pretty much no one will disagree with that. You touched on a very important thing, just wanting to, before that, about things like the rights of Allah.
Right.
Right, it's something that it's the basis of the creation itself, why we're here, right? To serve, to worship Allah, to glorify Allah. And I think one way of summarizing what you said about that would be just your intention.
Right.
Why are you doing that? Why are you doing that activism? Why are you joining that union in your university? Why are you campaigning against Islamophobia or racism or whatever it is?
Right.
Right. First and foremost, we should encourage that it's for the sake of Allah, because Allah put you here, put me here, gave us some rights and responsibilities, and because that actually changes practically how we go about doing stuff.
Right.
Right. If my if my hijab or beard or whatever is in order to please Allah first and foremost, I'm going to act a bit differently than if my hijab or beard or whatever kind of identifiable aspect of me, if that's just to identify me as a Muslim,
Right.
that's my identity, that's my group, that's my tribe, then you're going to obviously act differently, right? So my Islamic practice is going to perhaps go so far and cease at the point as me being identified as a Muslim, and then maybe I wouldn't push myself further. But if I'm doing it for something else, if I'm doing it, yeah, identify as a Muslim, but because, you know, I want to glorify Allah, and that is something I think we can tap into and give as a practical kind of advice for young brothers and sisters going into universities, going into political parties even. You know, what's your intention? I want to do something good because it's a divine obligation to do.
Right, and also, like, you know, it's interesting because, you know, with a lot of kind of apolitical mosques, you'll find that that they're willing to preach a certain sentiment about the faith, right, and about our relationship to Allah. But they don't take that as a natural consequence into the real world. So, for example, they'll teach you, La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. There's no power or might that exists except that which resides with God. Right? It's an amazing concept that we have in our religion. Okay, it's a sentiment that actually many of us recite after each daily prayer. Right? So 5 times a day at least, you're reciting that specific phrase, reminding yourself that any power that there exists in this universe is actually first and foremost derived from the power that Allah has over everything. Right? So that should be emancipatory in many ways. That should free you from the shackles and the burdens of these kind of mind-forged manacles, to quote William Blake, that are inside our heads, that restrict us, that constrict us when we fear the world that we live in, right? Because we already know that there is something greater and more powerful than anything else that can live in this world. But when you go into the mosque then and you say, and the mosque says to you things like, for example, I won't name the mosque, but our local mosque in South London, when the Americans were carpet bombing Iraq, this was during Ramadan, if you remember, they refused to make dua qunut for the Iraqi people. Okay, and we said, why? Like, you're not praying for terrorists, you're praying that people don't suffer and they're not killed in a bombing campaign. And they refused to do so because they said that we're worried that we will be seen as supporting terrorism somehow if we make this prayer during the salah. Now, like, you can preach and wax lyrical as much as you want then about Tawheed, about the oneness of God, about the power of God and His might, and so on and so forth. But there now exists a disconnect between the faith that you practice in the world, okay, and your actual understanding of who Allah is and His power and His ability to do things, right? So what I'm saying is that actually this fear that we have and that is that sometimes overtakes us is in and of itself problematic in terms of the relationship that we have, in terms of our identity here in the world that we live in.
So do you think that's a contributing factor to maybe Muslims who see bad stuff happening, who see stuff that needs to be changed, not going to their community and help building something truly Islamic from their own lens, and going to maybe joining with non-Muslim organizations that maybe don't have their own best interests at heart, their akhirah, their relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala?
I mean, I think it goes both ways, right? Like, yeah, that may be one part of it. Like, you're a young person, you go to the mosque, you're interested in what's going on in different situations in the UK or even around the world, right? And all you're told is that we can't deal with this stuff, we can't talk about it, we can't do talks on it because we're worried about how we will be perceived if we do, right? So your primary role as an imam, okay, as a masjid, which is to give guidance to your community, you're unwilling to do because the questions that they have, you're unwilling to engage with. So now they're left with the rest of the world, right? Because there's a whole world out there that's willing to look at this stuff. So whether it's people who are talking about these things in the right wing or the left wing or wherever, right? Like, there are opportunities and avenues, including people who are talking about it in a kind of religious cadence. Okay, so groups that we don't agree with their methodology, we don't agree with what they promote. Okay, but they're all out there. Okay, and so if you're not willing to fulfill your primary function, okay,
someone else is going to do it.
Then somebody else is going to do it, and it's ultimately disempowering because it means that the mosque is no longer a space that is welcoming. It's no longer a space of learning. It's no longer a space of intellectualism. It's actually a space for pacification.
How do you change that? Is that, some would say maybe cynically, that is by design?
Yeah, I
that
agree.
to remove any maybe activism or any political agency or strength from the mosque space.
Yeah, I mean it's very colonial in its technique, you know, and anybody who's studied the history of the French in Algeria or the British in India, or you know the French and British in Egypt, and so on and so forth. The list goes on and on, right? Will tell you that this is a very consistent tactic that was used, okay, in order to pacify populations. The problem is that it often results in a reaction that is extremely problematic. And so, you know, mosques want to talk about the fact that, well, oh, okay, you know, well, we need to engage with the government's prevent program because if we don't, it's going to be problematic. And yes, there is a problem with terrorism out there. Yeah, we accept that there is because obviously people have committed acts of terrorism, right? But what did you do in order to create a space that allowed for people to air their grievances and to really tackle the issues of the day? Okay, and that's the entire issue, right? And it comes back to our first conversation that this manifest fear that exists, it inhibits us from being political. Okay, and so, you know, people will say, well, you know, anybody who's involved in politics, okay, and here obviously I make a distinction between politics as in parliamentary politics, as in kind of being involved in political activity, right? So let's concentrate on the latter, just being political. Okay, that you know, somehow by being involved in politics, you are an Islamist, right? This is the term that they like to think that, oh, well, the only Muslims who are interested in politics, okay, are these Islamist types. Okay, for a start, you know, that word in and of itself is a product of colonization, right? So I don't even agree with using it. But it's also political in and of itself, because nobody will charge, for example, the late Grand Mufti of Al-Azhar, Ali Gum'a, for okaying violence against protesters in Egypt after the coup in religious language. So he writes a fatwa to say that it's okay to kill these protesters, right? But that's him engaging in the political. That's the religious sphere engaging in the political landscape, right? But nobody calls that out for Islamism, or nobody calls out for Islamism those imams who go around saying it's okay to join the British Army, to go and fight in the British Army and kill other Muslims in other parts of the world for the British Army. That's them engaging in the political again, right? So
Islamist is reserved for the person, a Muslim who engages in political activism against the interest of the person using the word Islamist.
Right, exactly.
Pretty much.
Exactly. And so it's a disempowering tool, right? So the accusation is leveled at a person in order to disempower them. Okay. Whereas what we should be saying is actually, no, Muslims need to be more political. They need to be more politically active, not because of political reasons, because it's part of our faith to do so. It's intrinsic in our faith to be political, because how can you exist outside of the real world? Like, your faith is connected to the world around you. And and to be in the world around you means to be political. It means to be an agent that is either an agent that is a subject or is active, right? And so we sometimes talk about citizens v subjects, right? Like, are we just subjects to this state, or actually we active citizens within it who are able to affect change?
That's a good. I want to pick up on that in a minute, inshallah. But before just to summarize, you're talking about politics and the political and the different meanings of it. Could you just define what you mean by politics? Because this is a question that's come up in the comments, somebody on social media, and it's a good question because a lot of people use the word politics and political.
Well, so I mean, like I just said, I don't mean to narrow it to being involved in political parties. You know, it's like that's a.
Let me rephrase it. What does political mean to you as a Muslim?
For me to be political is just to live in the real world. That's it. Like, you know.
What is the objective of politics for a Muslim, and how is it different to the objective of politics for somebody
even
else?
the idea of that, okay, for me is a wrongful construction, because it takes into account a framework, okay, that I don't think personally I've ever understood from my faith. For my faith is that okay, my faith has certain obligations on me, okay, in order to live in the real world and to understand it and to be an agent inside the real world. And therefore, to be political means for me to just practice my faith. And by virtue of practicing my faith, to be involved in all of the activities
Wherever you are.
wherever I am, you know. And so, if that means, for example, you know, helping out at food banks, that's what it means to be a Muslim. But it's also what it means to be political. If it means like looking for, you know, standing at demonstrations, that's what it means, right? So, what I'm trying to say is that some of these are false dichotomies that exist because of modernity. Modernity makes us use a vernacular, okay, about who we are, that I think is problematic. I think actually what we want is for us to be thinking about, you know, what it means to be a Muslim, okay, in the world that we live in today, okay, and not reduce ourselves to, for example, party politics or you know, anything else. These are all things that are that reduce us. They don't elevate us. They don't take into account the richness of our own tradition.
It reminds me of, I think Ibn Qayyim, rahimahullah, he said, or Shaykh Islam Ibn Taymiyyah, he said, Islam, the Sharia seeks to increase good and decrease harm and bad wherever it is. It's not, we have this idea sometimes that one day we'll implement Sharia, we'll implement Islam.
Right.
No, Islam is being implemented now.
Right.
Anywhere
right,
you are.
Right. Exactly.
If you can reduce the size of some munkar, something condemnable,
Right.
if you could increase the size of something good, something beneficial to people, then that's what the Sharia is telling you to do at that moment in time.
Right.
And true wisdom isn't recognizing something bad or something good. As the quote goes, we'll go back to the quote, true wisdom is, the true fiqh is recognizing between two good things what is better, and between two bad things what is worse, that you may reduce it or avoid that. You know, so it's useful looking at these things as a spectrum, as a continuum. You know, that you may remember Robocop. He just used to look around. You know, you can detect things, and I suppose people now would think Iron Man or whatever. That's the thing right now. Yeah. So you know, you're looking through your own lens as a Muslim, right? This is what being political or just politics means to you, is through your lens as a Muslim. Whenever you see a situation where, you know, there's some harm happening, there's some wrongdoing happening, you can reduce that, you can get rid of that. Your obligation then is to do that.
Right. I agree to that to some extent, but I also think that we also suffer from a lack of imagination too. And that lack of imagination, I think, rests in this idea that that this is it. That the way that the modern world looks like right now is the only thing that is ever going to be. And everyone has always thought, with whichever period that they were in, right, that this was it, right?
Yeah.
Rather than
This is
thinking
universal.
rather than thinking about the fact that actually kind of hyper neoliberal market economics and politics it doesn't necessarily have to be the way that the world looks.
It's
right?
relatively new.
It's relatively new, and quite frankly, it's extremely destructive. And I don't think that, you know, it can rest on itself in the way that it stands right now. And so, like, you know, when we think about what it means to have identity, what it means to be represented, right, to be you know, out there gaining fame and gaining notoriety within a system that is already being proven to be problematic. I think that's an issue, that we don't have that imagination that actually, you know, my being in the world can actually be different. So I don't, for example,
That, I mean, sorry to cut you off,
no,
but
go
that
ahead.
Muslims have contributed to the status quo,
Right.
right? We weren't kind of just silent onlookers or bystanders. We're something like the quarter of the world's population, right? And the current status quo, neoliberal economics, the way the world is structured now, Muslims have had a hand in this, whether we like to admit it or not. You know, U.S. domination, for example, there's been a lot of research into looking at, you know, the U.S. directly funding certain narratives, certain, for example, anti-communist, you know, movements and theologies across the Muslim world, which contributed to this wave of free market, or what is being described as free market neoliberal, economics and that kind of stuff. So that's perhaps an example of where things can go wrong when Muslims don't control their own narratives and their own discourse.
Right,
around the need for what we're talking about here, for Muslims to do their own politics.
And there was so much written, especially around the 2008 financial crisis, right? About the fact that actually, there were so many economists who wrote the same article, which is, had Muslims held on to their own ideals of what markets should look like, they would have inoculated themselves from the financial crisis, right? And I think that's something interesting to think about. I mean, the reality is that the way that the world is the way that the world is, unfortunately. What I'm saying is that we shouldn't think of representation as being limited to gaining a foothold in the way that the world exists right now. Like, that for me is problematic, and so if your ideal is to be like the icon, on the front of GQ magazine, okay, as a Muslim, and you feel, right, that's it, Muslims have made it, right? Like this is it. We've arrived, okay, and the guy's got a beard and he's on the front of GQ. That's it. Everything's good in the world.
Racism is finished.
Right. For me, that's not representation.
Yeah.
At the best, maybe that's assimilation. At the very best, okay. But there are things that you have to give up along the way to get there. Right.
So,
and it's actually in that journey that is the biggest problem, because once you get to that, to that moment, that front, kind of front page, cover, magazine, shoot, whatever, then by then you've already given up a lot. And we need to have a conversation about what that means to give up those things on the way to that journey.
So this speaks to the kind of dichotomy that you described of this: are you a citizen or are you a subject? Can you explain that then? So the the subject would be someone who perhaps thinks like this: that if I'm given a few crumbs from the table of the existing setup, then I've made it.
Right.
If I become a peer, or not a peer but a peer, an MP or something, I'm given some kind of status within the current structure of things. Even though that maybe you can argue that the system or the machine is geared towards some type of injustice or dhulm, I've made it.
I don't want to think of it in terms of like mechanistically, like what does the individual personal position look like? I think it's more an ethical thing, because when we talk about like the citizen versus the subject, as I said in my book, that was the one thing I struggled with most, and it mostly came out of a discussion that I had around Surah Ghafir, when I'm reflecting on the secret believer that belongs to the family of Pharaoh. And this is a man that's praised by Allah, but he occupies such a position in Pharaoh's court that he's in a position to advise Pharaoh not to do something, right? For me, this man, he like disrupts me completely, because like
he's in a system.
He's in a system. He's inside the system. Okay, maybe somebody we might even like, kind of like condemn for being there, right? But uses his position. But I think that's the distinction between him and everyone else. Well, Qarun's a completely different thing. We can talk about him in a second, actually, because I think he is a perfect example of the subject, okay? The secret believer uses the position that he has to actually affect change. So maybe he is the one example that we can really think of, like of somebody who went through the ranks, okay, and finally had a position of authority and power and prestige and privilege, and then used his voice in order to affect some change. Now, Qarun's the exact opposite, and he's in the same surah, and I really think that the juxtaposition between the two is really amazing. And again, like I have an extended like discussion about this in the book. But Qarun, Allah says that Qarun betrayed his own people, right? That's like, it's an amazing thing that he's actually from Bani Israel, but he's given this position of authority, okay?
The native informant, the salah.
But he's a native informant, right? He uses his position in order to what? to harm the people who should be protecting, to harm the people who should be hurting. So the secret believer is actually from the family of Fir'aun. He shares blood with Fir'aun, right? Qarun shares blood with Bani Israel.
They're both kind of...
They're opposites to one
yeah,
another. So actually what we need to be looking at is our ethics. Okay, are we able, and that's the hard part, right? And that's why, like, I don't have any envy towards those who take the path towards political participation. I think it's a really hard thing to do.
Within the system?
Within the system. Yeah. I mean, like, for me, I find it easier for me to be outside of the system because maybe I'm such a weak person that I just feel like this is where I can protect my faith the best, you know, in terms of being able to hold on to my values and in terms of being able to be very moralistic, or try to be at least anyway, about my faith, about my relationship to God. I think that people who do go down the path of trying to affect change and who do it sincerely for the sake of Allah, and get into party politics to bring that change because they very much believe in it, I have no envy for them, because that is a really hard thing to do. It's a very difficult position to be in, and I wouldn't want to make the kind of sacrifices and compromises that they have to make inevitably from being in that position. Now, of course, like how Allah judges them, only Allah can decide and determine, and it's definitely not on us to do. All we can do, and this is, I think, part of their test, is respond to them when they step out of line. And I think that's the really hard part for people who do engage in party politics, because if you step out of line and you say something that goes against the interests of your community or communities around the world, then you will be called out for it and you will be held to account, right? And that can't be easy, to hear your own community then, kind of see you in a bad way or call you names or whatever else, right?
Yeah.
But that's part of the reality that you then, they say that heavy is the head that wears the crown, right? And it's true, it is. Okay, but I think that they have to have a thick skin to deal with it, and they should then listen when their community calls them out and says that you've done wrong here. I think they should be more open.
So we all have an obligation really then to those Muslims who have gone down that path of, trying to affect change within the system as it is. It's a bit of a tough one, because if you just come out and there's a lot of abuse that's leveled to these people, and that kind of reinforces almost the kind of dichotomy in their minds that these people who are criticizing me, they don't know what it's like. Someone has to do this job. Right. Someone has to rub shoulders with, evil people and shake hands of ambassadors from countries that are doing unspeakable evil and all that kind of stuff. But they, it's important that when they see criticism, and when we level criticism against them, we do it from a position of really wanting to advise them sincerely. Right. Because because at the end of the day, a lot of these things are matters of ijtihad, really.
Well, I mean, yeah, absolutely.
Right.
But it depends on how they position themselves too. Like, like there are certain people that we would have less time for, okay, because they've clearly put themselves out there as neocons. Like, so for example, in the early days of the War on Terror, if you were happy to like stand there and have photographs taken with George Bush and Dick Cheney and Madeleine Albright and all of these people, right? Then I would suggest that you have extremely problematic politics, okay, and that you've actually gone beyond that simple, okay, this is a person who's making mistakes. I think that person then comes into a whole new category.
So let me put this to you then. Is that not because the people who are sincere, who do want to please Allah, who do have Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and glorifying Him and genuinely doing good and increasing khair and decreasing shar, those people, is the presence of such people not because the people who should have been in those positions didn't, because they are saying, I want to avoid situations where I'm going to have to make tough decisions?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's a difference. There's a distinction between, being political and being politics, like we already talked about before, and being apolitical. So not being in politics, and as in party political politics, doesn't give you an excuse to be apolitical, right?
Yeah.
So for those people who don't get involved for that reason, okay, if they're not involved full stop, then that's a different matter. Then you're in the
Yeah.
bystander section.
Yeah.
Then you're in an entirely different category of individual who effectively is willing to watch the world burn and, you know,
Because you're afraid of-
carry on drinking from an
Yeah.
unlimited tap of water. You know,
Yeah.
that's like that's what you're like then. You're just watching everything burn and you're just happy to drink away and not even be concerned about the fact that things are in flame in front of you. Okay? And I think that's important for us to think about.
I think one of the reasons,
Yeah.
right, if I may, one of the reasons why this is a difficult question is precisely because of the title of this discussion.
Right.
Because Muslims, perhaps enough Muslims from the right type of thinking and a unifying kind of a mainstream approach, we didn't pay as much attention as we should have to creating our own discourse, our own narratives about the Muslim political, desire or needs in the 21st century in wherever we are. So we're in the UK, obviously. We're talking about a UK context. So now, isn't this one of the reasons why, that the so-called good Muslim, and I don't want to offend anyone by saying that, but the good Muslim who wants to be sincere, he or she is not going down this path because they see, people taking pictures of Dick Cheney or whatever, really, almost literally selling their own community for a cheap dollar or dime. They see that as politics. Or the Muslim who has to assimilate so much of his or her Islam in order to gain entry into somebody else's political project.
Right.
Right? The left wing or the right wing political party or whatever. Because we don't have something for them that, look, this is where you enter, this is how you can contribute to a genuine story and genuine narrative of your own political will. Right? This seems to me like one of the clearest, incentives for us to try and do something like this. So how do we do this?
Like various people have tried different things at different points. So I don't think it's a case that no one's ever done anything. Like for example, the Murabitun across the world really tried very hard with varying degrees of success to extricate themselves from from the fiat currency system. Okay, now for me,
Going back to gold and silver.
Yeah, the endeavor, the thinking, the endeavor is something that I found remarkable, and I think it's something that I feel very proud of. That even if they didn't achieve it on a large scale, the fact that they were involved in the ideas, that the fact that they were thinking about this, the fact that they didn't just say, you know what, we're all subject to this worldwide banking system. This is what the new status quo is. We're never going to be able to change it, so let's just give up and forget about it, right? Like, no, they said, no, actually, this is a problem. Like, how can we even think about, like, having something like legitimate zakah when this is what the state of finances in the world looked like, right?
Yeah.
And so, I think that there are things that have happened in the past. There are things that people are thinking about, and even now, you have lots of different thinkers. The ones that I'm more familiar with are the ones who write in English. Okay, but I know there are plenty of scholars in the Arabic language, and actually even outside of the Arabic language, and in Farsi and Urdu and so many other different languages who are thinking and write about these things. Which is to kind of think about the world in different ways. So, for example, Wa'il Halak has his book, The Impossible State, and afterwards Restating Orientalism, which both kind of, again, critique modernity and the problems with the modernity. You have scholars such as Salman again, who are positing ideas about, what the Ummah as a horizon might, potentially look like as a potential something. Okay, and these are important ideas for us to be engaging with, because what they do is that they again remind us, okay, that the status quo isn't something that will last forever. So even if like the end conclusion that Salman Sayyid comes up with, or Wa'il Halak come up with, okay, are ones that we might disagree with, or other people might disagree with, that's not the point here. The point is that they're engaged in an exercise, okay, that reminds us that this doesn't have to be it. That you can, if you want, choose to find a more just world than this. And I think that's part of like what I take so much heart from it in terms of Islam and the practice of Islam. That our faith places such a high gives such a high place to justice itself. And I love that statement of Ibn Taymiyyah, where he says that Allah will give dominion on the earth to those who establish justice, even if they're from the disbelievers. Right? I think that's a remarkable kind of ethic for us to constantly think about. That that the primacy of justice in our lives is so great, it's so high, that actually what Allah wants to be established is this idea of good governance and justice. Okay, now what that political system looks like, that's for us to determine, right? That's for us to actually bring about, okay, whatever its name might be, okay? But that's the emphasis, okay, to bring that equity within society, so people know where they stand before the law, and that ultimately that law is in congruence with what Allah wants.
So one thing is, in terms of moving forward, and the phrase that a brother gave me on social media, I really like it, is political creativity, right? One of the ways to be creative and original is read Wa'il al-Halaq, Salman Sayyid, these types of people.
Well, there's many other people than them.
Decolonial thinkers and people who are trying to highlight, the fact that the current system quo, modernity, isn't the be all and end all. It's not universally true, like gravity or something.
Right.
That's the thinking part. In terms of political creativity, what else do you advise? Muslims who want to, don't want to do something, want to live their deen in the political realm.
Right. So I mean, like for me, the book's called A Virtue of Disobedience, but there are 3 areas that I really think that at least we can start some kind of degree of resistance from, right?
Okay.
And these 3 areas that I posit are in our language, that we have to start changing our language in order to reconstruct ourselves in our own image, okay, in an image that's authentic to being Muslim. So for example, those people who use the word Islamist, they just need to stop using that word. It is a pejorative that comes out of the colonial era, and it's there specifically used to depoliticize us. Okay, it's used as I don't care what.
Exactly what an Islamist would say.
It's a pejorative. Okay, in our knowledge, in the way that we construct knowledge. Okay, about what knowledge is and who constructs who we are as Muslim. Okay, and so we have to take people to task for the nonsense that they write about Muslims. Okay, we have to construct our own knowledge bases about who we are and the way in which we understand the world. Okay, rather than it being something that we're constantly externally constructed. Okay, and the final one is in community, is in re-establishing an idea of community that doesn't separate us on geographical lines, that doesn't separate us along ethnic lines. And there's a lot of discussion recently in our communities, okay, about, for example, black brothers and sisters feeling like they've been disenfranchised, okay, from other types of Muslims, okay, and I've spoken to a number of different imams who have complained about this phenomenon themselves, and that's important because we need to actually not just kind of wax lyrical about the ummah, but the ummah has to become something that's real, that's actualized, something that people feel as if they are part of, and not just a theoretical concept that might exist one day.
Okay, subhanAllah. So, in summary, going back to what you mentioned in the book, number 1, language, number 2, knowledge, production, and number 3, community, unity, genuine, ummatic unity. Right? An hour's flown by, subhanAllah. I really enjoyed the discussion. I hope it's the start of many more, inshallah. We just scratched the surface. And I'd like to thank you on behalf of our viewers and everyone at Islam 21C for joining us in this big discussion one-on-one. Jazakumullah khairan, brothers and sisters and friends watching at home. The recording of this live discussion will be on Islam21c.com in the next few hours, hopefully, inshallah, or at least days. And I hope you'll join us at Islam 21C and any all of our guests from Cage in taking this conversation forward and carrying it on over the coming days and weeks. I've been your host, Salman, but with our gracious guest, Asim Qureshi. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamu alaikum.